Before we start the podcast, we wanted to let you know about Voas. If you're a teacher or pupil at a school in Scotland, then you now have access to hundreds of quality assured video lessons created by teachers to support your remote learning. You should be able to find Voas within the app library of Glow, where you can add the tile to your own personal launchpad. Click on the tile and you'll have immediate access to stream lessons in every area of the Scottish curriculum, with video lessons already available for biology at National 5, Higher and Advanced Higher. Now let's get on with the podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Lecky textbooks, revision guides and practice papers. Everything you need to learn, review and prepare for your SQA exams. Browse the books at www.leckyscotland.co.uk and get 40% off using the discount code LECKYPODCAST40. You can now also collect Young Scot reward points by using the codes within the description of each episode. To claim discounts and rewards on their website, www.young.scot.
And freezing cold nights, the hand that's inside the cow is nice and warm, but the other one is absolutely perished.
In this podcast, we will learn about animal welfare with Scotland's Chief Veterinary Officer, Sheila Voas. We will also hear from award-winning farmers Jim and Anne Smiley of Corrie Farm, as we discover the secret to getting a nice yellow yolk and what the best size of egg to buy is, as they share how they ensure their flocks are happy and healthy. We'll be referring to the SQA course specification for higher biology and helping you to understand some of the key concepts. An animal health and welfare strategy covering all of Great Britain has been in place since 2004. However, the devolution of animal health budgets in 2011 has given the Scottish Government more scope to set its own priorities. Agriculture is vital to Scotland's economy. The livestock industry alone supports just under 35,000 jobs and contributes £1.6 billion worth of output. Animals farmed as a source of food are usually kept in artificial conditions in order to maximise economic yield of saleable food such as meat, milk or eggs. The Chief Veterinary Officer plays a key role in advising government on animal health and welfare, and so there is no one better placed to help us understand this key area than Sheila Voas.
Yeah, my name's Sheila Voas. I'm a vet and my current role is as Chief Veterinary Officer for Scotland. What that means is that I am responsible for providing advice to Scottish ministers on matters of animal health and welfare and trying to improve the lot of animals in Scotland generally. I deal with things like zoonotic disease, which is disease that spreads between animals and humans, and that's very topical at the moment. I'm very busy with Brexit at the moment, but animal welfare is a big part of my role too, trying to make sure it's improved as we go forward.
I guess we must have a lot of animals in Scotland, Sheila.
We do. Both companion animals, dogs, cats, horses, rabbits, snakes, lizards, but also farming and production animals. And farming and production are one of the things that we've done nationally for a long time. We excel in particularly grass-fed systems in this country. So the main production systems are beef and sheep, and they're largely extensive systems, but we also have a number of more intensive systems for example, dairy cattle, pigs, poultry, and of course salmon.
Intensive or battery systems reduce inputs such as feed due to the restriction of animal movement. With lower financial inputs, economic yield is more profitable. However, this may occur at a cost to animal welfare, and high levels of animal stress can actually reduce productivity. Due to the internet and easier access to information, as consumers we should be more aware than ever of where our food comes from, and ensuring that we are educated in order to allow us to make informed choices.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you're covering this in the course. It frustrates me that sometimes people don't know where their food comes from and aren't able to make decisions about it. Our biggest systems in Scotland are the extensive ones, so the sheep that you would see grazing on the hillside and beef cattle which live large parts of their lives outside. But we do have the intensive systems. And I guess pigs and poultry are the ones that most people would think about when we talk about intensive. Although for some dairy farms, that can be quite an intensive production system too.
Why are those intensive farming systems, why are those less ethical than the free-range farming?
It's generally considered less ethical to farm intensively, but I think we need to be careful about the difference between welfare and ethics. There are a number of reasons that have driven people to produce food more intensively, largely because it's easier to produce a lot of food cheaply to fulfill the needs of society who demand cheap food. And also the government drive after the last war was for lots of food to be produced as cheaply as possible. But it comes with compromises, and some of those compromises are ethical, which is philosophical. It's about moral principles, but there are also welfare compromises for the animals themselves, particularly around the freedom to express normal behaviour, which is severely limited in some intensive systems.
The concept of natural behaviour emphasises that animals need positive experiences in addition to minimise suffering, and this began to be recognised in the UK following a parliamentary inquiry into the welfare of animals in intensive livestock production systems in 1965, which recognised that farmed animals should be able to stand up, lie down, turn around, stretch their limbs and groom their body. This was extended in 1979 to encompass both physical and mental needs of animals, such as avoiding fear and distress and express normal behaviour. What emerged from this were 5 freedoms.
Well, the 5 freedoms were thought of a number of years ago, and really they're a basic minimum that all animals should have access to. The freedoms themselves are freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from pain and discomfort or disease, freedom to express the normal behaviours, and freedom from fear and distress. So in intensive systems, it's perfectly possible to meet quite a number of these, such as providing good quality diet, water, and treating any animals that have pain, injury or disease. It's much harder to manage the ability to express normal behaviour when animals are intensively produced. So I guess some examples are that normal behaviour in intensive systems can be compromised by, for example, farrowing stalls in sows and pigs, where in order to prevent piglets being lain upon, the sow is maintained in quite a tight space, unable to turn around, and that can lead to bar chewing and inability to produce a nest for her piglets. So that limits her ability to behave in the normal way that a sow about to farrow would behave.
Well, what are we doing in Scotland to kind of ensure that those freedoms are put in place and that to encourage people to go beyond that?
Well, the laws are put in place by government, either because government themselves think it's a good idea, and that would be through introducing primary legislation, or because they've been put in place at European level. Once the laws are in place, though, we then go out and make sure that there are people checking and enforcing, so that if there are problems, they're picked up and farmers are penalised. But more importantly, any welfare deficits are corrected for the animals to make suffering as small as possible. And that's done by an agency called the Animal and Plant Health Agency, who have responsibility for field inspections. And they do that both on a proactive basis by going out to farms on a random allocation, but they also respond to complaints from members of the public where people think there might be something wrong, and they go out and look and check. And sometimes there is, but often there isn't.
You had mentioned that one of the things that was keeping you busy at the moment was Brexit. What does that mean in reality for kind of the welfare of the animals in Scotland?
I'd like to think that it doesn't mean any decrease in standards and will give us even more opportunity to make things better. Although I have to say, membership of the EU hasn't really limited us in our ability to go beyond what the EU has required. For example, we banned sow stalls where sows were tethered about 10 years before the rest of Europe. We have gone further than other European countries in other things to make sure animal welfare is protected. But there is a downside to that in that it's less profitable for people farming and food becomes more expensive when it's produced to these higher standards, which I guess comes back to people's choices and understanding the difference between different food production systems and choosing what people want to spend their money on.
What would you say to somebody that wasn't really sure of what to choose when it comes to cheap food and considering animal welfare?
My personal view is that it would be better to eat less meat and animal products, but to make sure that what you are eating is good quality. And generally, I would say that what we produce in Scotland is of good quality. It's not perfect, there's room for improvement, but generally the standards here are higher than those in food that we import.
Within the higher course, we need to know some of the behavioural indicators of poor animal welfare, including stereotypy, misdirected behaviour, failure in sexual or parental behaviour, and altered levels of activity. On page 172 of the Lecky Higher Biology student book, there's a picture of a tiger being kept in a small area within a zoo as an example of stereotypy.
We don't farm them very often in Scotland. In fact, we don't farm them at all. However, you do see stereotypies in some intensively reared animals here. And I go back to the example of sows in farrowing crates, where if they're unable to nest and to carry out the normal maternal behaviour that they would, they may chew on bars or play with nipple drinkers and cause water to spread everywhere. And that's really displacement behaviour. It's doing something for the sake of doing something rather than what it is that they actually want to be doing, if I can use the emotive want.
We might not farm them in Scotland, but the repetitive and unusual behaviour patterns directed towards the environment can be observed in lions or tigers pacing to and fro in their cage, and are ultimately a behavioural indicator that these beautiful animals' welfare is being impacted by not being in their natural environment in the wild. Sheila went on to give us some examples of misdirected behaviour.
Probably the best example of that is tail biting, where pigs that are not given the opportunity to play and investigate their surroundings by having fairly basic and unenriched areas will go to biting things they shouldn't, particularly the tails of other pigs. It can be rectified by using manipulable materials, by giving them things to play with, whether that's wood to chew or chains or hoses or balls, or best of all, straw, so that they can nose about and play with it and rustle and generally distract themselves. Pigs are very intelligent and they do need to keep their brains occupied as well as everything else.
I guess that could be the same could be said for birds and hens and chickens when they start to pull out their own feathers. That would be the same sort of behaviour.
It's exactly the same. Feather pecking in poultry, which is seen much more in laying poultry who are kept for longer periods of time than the average broiler chicken, will sometimes show that displacement activity because they are unable to peck and find food in the way they normally would. They start pecking other things. And of course, once they've drawn blood, then they become quite carnivorous and can really cause a lot of damage to another bird.
We will hear more about egg-laying hens and how this misdirected behaviour can be avoided with the simple pleasure of a football later in the podcast. For now though, we'll go back to Sheila to hear about how failure in sexual or parental behaviour can be an indicator of poor animal welfare.
There are a number of examples. There are some breeds of turkey that just cannot reproduce on their own anymore. We've altered their appearance and their size and shape to such an extent that they can't mate. But probably more easy to understand examples would be that very highly performing animals, and I guess dairy cows are the good example, sometimes are growing or producing so much milk that stops their reproductive cycle, and so it can be difficult to get them back into calf again. Similarly, it can be quite difficult with sheep. Sometimes sheep are brought inside to lamb, but that can lead to problems of mismothering and abnormal behaviour because they're not able to choose a quiet corner somewhere away from the rest of the flock to have their lambs, and so they reject their offspring. So there can be other problems as a result of the way we look after animals.
And I guess that causes big knock-on effects for the farmer.
Yes, it does. Mismothering can be a real problem where you get one very maternal animal, usually an auntie, who steals half a dozen lambs before she has her own, and then when she has her own, she rejects the ones that she's stolen. In the cattle, inability to get them back into calf obviously means that when they stop producing milk, it will be longer before they start again, because in order to have milk, you need to have a calf. And generally, cows will have a calf, they'll produce milk for about 9-10 months, they'll have a rest for a couple of months, and then they'll produce another calf. So if you're extending that period where they're not having a calf, it's making it more expensive for the farmer to keep them.
Animals kept in poor conditions can become less active as a result of stress. Equally, the opposite can be true, and some animals experiencing high levels of stress can become unusually aggressive. Sheila went on to explain these altered levels of activity a wee bit further.
Yes, activity is dependent on animals' health. And so for some intensively kept animals, and I guess I'm thinking dairy cows in particular, you may get a reluctance to move, reduced levels of activity due to lameness, which is not uncommon, unfortunately. But it can also result in panicked behaviour. We can, as well as apathy, we can also get panic. For example, in broiler chickens, where if the light suddenly turned on or somebody comes in different coloured overalls that they may not recognise, you sometimes get them flocking to the far end, and that can cause smothering of other animals within the group, a sort of mania.
You know, the two words that we get introduced to within the higher course are apathy, as you mentioned, so kind of very low levels of activity compared to the norm. And then, as you explained there with the broiler hens, we also have hysteria, which refers to very high levels of activity.
Yes, so the mania that I mentioned could just as well be described as hysteria, where something out of the ordinary has happened, causing that panicked behaviour with adverse consequences for the whole group.
Broilers refer to chickens that are grown for the purpose of butchering and eating. Generally, broilers are fast-growing chickens with deeper muscle tissue, which means more meat. Commercial operations want their chickens to reach their butcher weight as fast as possible, so that they don't have to feed them as much food and they can be sold for meat quicker. Egg-laying hens are different, and as a result of decades of breeding, they have been bred for a very high production of eggs. With the UK alone estimated to eat over 30 million eggs each day, that's a lot of hens laying eggs to look after. I caught up with Jim and Anne from the multi-award winning free-range Corrie Mains farm in Ayrshire to find out more about how their business works and how they look after the welfare of their animals.
Started in 96.
Yeah, with 800 hens. Mm-hmm. And we've increased as demand has, wanted eggs. So we don't have big hen houses. We have very small numbers in houses. Capacity for 25,000. Our sheds we have 7 flocks, 7 different age groups, which are all in 3,000 to 4,000 birds per shed. Yeah. Now the norm for egg production is probably about 32,000 in one shed, all at the same age. But we have much smaller sheds, much smaller groups, and give them more room. That's where we differ.
Yeah, we're a traditional unit rather than a multi-tier unit.
And I guess that just gives the birds a lot more space to kind of display their natural behaviours.
Yes. Uh-huh. so they're all ground level. So they have a far easier access to come outside. Whereas big sheds with 32,000 on them, they could be 5 decks high. So if you're a hen on the 5th deck, you'll probably queue for a week to come down to the ground floor to actually be able to get access to outside. So we believe our customers demand that the traditional flat deck system is better.
And are those hens, they're allowed to just get outside whenever they feel like it then?
Yes, the doors open about 9 in the morning, and the hens can come in or go out as they wish. And at night time, it's daylight hours that really take them in. I know some people will, set a time to put their hens in, but we find it's easier if you just allow them to go in with natural daylight.
Maybe June time, the longest day, it could be about after 11 o'clock before they'll go in to their hen house. So we have to stay up to make sure they're all in their hen houses, and then we shut the doors down.
Whereas Christmas time, you can have them all inside for 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
But they'll stay out all daylight, from daylight. But you can't really decide. A hen will make its own mind up whether it wants to come in or go outside.
I guess that access to a natural environment and the space to display those behaviours, do you think that makes the hens happier? Can you see that in your hens?
Yes, I think you can.
We're freedom foods assured, so that's the RSPCA. So we're monitored by the RSPCA, which they would like. Well, which we have got is trees. We planted trees for shade and shelter, and then we've actually built shelters so they can go underneath them. If there's a hawk or a buzzard comes along, they can run underneath the shelters. So to protect them, So we do all these things to make their life a wee bit happier.
And do you think happy hens make for better eggs?
Oh, definitely.
Oh yeah, of course.
You want them to put on the proper amount of weight, so you govern, the lighting, the feed intake, trying to get as much weight onto them in the first few weeks as you can. You don't want to stimulate them with extra light so that they'll start to lay eggs too early. Then you'll just get hundreds of very small eggs. You really need to, give them the proper nourishment of food to get weight onto them before you give them extra light so that their bodies are ready to actually lay eggs. They have to be ready to start laying eggs, which probably would start about 20, 21 weeks. By that time, our hens are outside ranging. But in the morning...
Yeah, the doors open at 18 weeks.
Yeah, the doors are open at 18 weeks.
They come in at 16 weeks, which is called point of lay. But they don't actually start laying because we hold them back to get the body weights up so they're ready for laying. Some people push them really early and, just because they need the money from the sale of the eggs.
Yeah. You're actually probably producing less eggs, but they're all saleable rather than producing tons of small eggs. So it's all about feed ratios and what you expect from the hen. We've got birds out there just now who are 83 weeks, which is a fabulous age. And they've laid really well, they've laid good size eggs, and they're still going strong, and there's still no sign of them going away.
And I guess it must be quite a task to feed 25,000 hens and make sure that they've got enough calcium and other nutrients in their diet.
Yeah, it's a financial challenge, maybe more than anything. We deal with a commercial compound mill, and they mix up all our rations. We probably use maybe 4 or 5 different rations from the time the birds come in until they're maybe 80 odd weeks. To start with, it's a higher protein diet, so they're still putting on weight, and then as they go through, you're cutting out methionine and lysine to kind of stem the size of their eggs so that you're not stressing them too much by making them produce too big an egg. Then by the time they're maybe 50, 60 weeks, getting kind of into older age, you'll start to give them a higher calcium content in their diet. So it is all about feeding the hen to what its natural needs are, to what it does need.
And then what happens to the hens once they stop laying eggs?
They don't ever stop laying eggs. Once they get, now some of them could be 70 weeks, some of them could be 85 weeks, all depends. All different flocks are different, and it's not so much the age, it's the internal quality, the shell quality and internal quality. A hen will lay an egg right the way for years, but it will not be a commercially viable egg. So you're far better just turning them over and getting rid of them. So I'm afraid they go for slaughter, and you would clean the shed down, steam clean it all, fumigate it, sterilise it all, take swabs for salmonella, and then you would restock it again with new birds at 16 weeks.
And when those hens obviously have to go for slaughter, can they be used for any other purpose at that point?
They can be used for burgers, like chicken burgers and stuff like that. They do go to a meat manufacturer, and it's not even into dog food, it's for human consumption. They are used. I mean, there's not a huge weight on them. An egg-laying hen doesn't put on a lot of surplus weight. That's a broiler. The chicken that we would buy at the supermarket to eat, when it's killed, it's anything between 35 and 42 days old. It's maximised its weight gain by that time. Our hens, we don't see them till they're 16 weeks. And then we keep them for a further, probably till they're 80 weeks. So, but they don't put on weight. You could have a broiler hen at 35 days old, which would maximise itself out at 2-3 kilos, whereas ours will never even reach that weight. By the time they're 20 weeks, they might be 1.9 kilos, but they'll never put on any more weight.
And you guys are obviously the proud holders of the Scottish Egg Quality Award, I believe. What is that?
Yes.
What does that mean in terms of animal welfare for the hens?
All producers in Scotland participate and compete for this award. And it's a big thing. If you're an egg producer in Scotland, it is a big thing. We have won it more than anybody. Six times I think we've won it. And we believe that, yes, we do win it more than most because of our high animal welfare and the feed we give our birds and just the way we treat them. It is quality feeding. We don't scrimp on anything. If they need extra, they get it. Feeding is all ad lib. They don't have a limited diet. They can eat what they want. They're fed probably 5 times a day. The track goes round. It's a train track feeder they're on. So it's on 5 times. Now you will have the greedy hens that hears the train going, the track going, and it's up for a feed every time that track starts. It's not that it's hungry because the track's never empty. It just likes to hear the track. It gets up and it gets a favourite bits out the feeding. But they're never hungry. It's never empty. So
inside the hen house, footballs. They actually play with the footballs. They'll peck them, especially the colours out. The black and white hexagonal.
Yeah, the kind of first football you have for a wee boy, which is like just an ordinary lightweight plastic ball. We put in maybe 100 of them into a shed, but the black and white colour is something is off it very quickly.
We put in lead bottles, so they like the noise pecking the bottles. We put in lucerne bales, which hang from nets, and it's like small cuts.
It's like an activity gym for them, just to amuse them.
And pecker blocks for them to peck, So.
Hen husbandry, Paul, is very much about kind of prevention rather than cure. If you can keep them amused and stop them from pecking each other, or stop if hens start to peck each other, they will very quickly start like a sort of a cannibalistic tendency. But if you can prevent that, that's far better. So we're all about prevention rather than cure.
And one of the big parts of that, I guess, is just as simple as a flyaway football and a kickabout.
That's it. Just keeps them busy,
I can't imagine that you guys are ever short of eggs in your own kitchen. What's your favourite? What's your favourite type of eggs, and have you got any tips for anybody cooking eggs?
I think at the moment we've got a young flock of young birds. They're only 21 weeks, so they've only been laying for the first maybe a week now, and they're laying tiny wee small eggs. So they are probably the best, and they're great poached. I mean, I've seen at lunchtime, maybe just doing sausages in a jar of tomato pasta sauce and then dropping in maybe a dozen pullet eggs and just sticking it in the oven to finish it off. That's lovely. But just pullet eggs, the small ones, but again, there's not a huge market for them because you don't have them long. I mean, a flock of hens will lay them for couple of weeks,
2 weeks,
2 weeks maximum, and then they're into mediums. And mediums is a very saleable size, so we don't have smalls for long.
Medium is a good egg. I would. Supermarkets have changed. They always used to like medium eggs, but now they prefer large eggs. So they're getting all their producers, that supply the supermarkets to lay large eggs, which puts a bigger strain on the hen to lay the larger egg. But we prefer. We think a medium egg is a nice egg to cook with.
Why do you think a medium egg then? What's good about cooking with a medium egg?
It's the youngest. It's the youngest hen that lays that size. As the hen gets older, it will eventually go into large. So the quality is always better with the medium egg.
There's all the restaurants in Glasgow that use our eggs for poaching, which poaching is a big thing now in a lot of the cafes and delis in Glasgow. Everybody wants a poached egg, whether it's eggs Benedict or whatever they're having. It's all medium eggs that they use.
Mm-hmm.
Before we finish, Jim and Anne let us in on a little secret about how they get their yolks to be such a bright colour.
There is a natural colourant goes into the feeding. Marigold feeding goes into that to to help the colour of the yolk.
Yeah.
Just an extra wee story. That was coming from China originally, and it's not coming from China anymore. There was a supply of it in Germany, but now they can't get it anymore either. Our feed company, the company we use, had sent a plane. What I've been told now is they sent a private jet out to bring back everything they could, and they were carrying over, I think it was £3 million worth of yolk pigment, just to keep that feed mill going for as long as they could see.
Ground down marigold.
It's ground down marigold.
And what would happen then if you didn't have that additive in the hen feed?
Your yolk would be wishy-washy colour.
Well,
and a lot of people think that it's eating grass that gives them a nice yolk. It's not. It is what they eat. It is what you artificially give them to eat.
Of course, that's an extra cost to us to get the yolks.
And it's like our unique selling point is we have really nice dark orange yolks, which are far tastier.
That supplement then, that's just coming from I guess the marigold plant, is it?
Yeah, just a natural additive, natural extra.
Yeah, I think the marigold's part of the sunflower family, so you can imagine where.
Yeah, that's right.
As Jim and Anne explained, a lot goes into ensuring the welfare of their hens, and as a result, the quality of their eggs. Let's go back and hear from Sheila on why these free-range products can sometimes be a little bit more expensive.
A lot of it comes down to the price of land. If you need 100 acres rather than 1 acre to keep the same number of animals, then that land is almost by definition less productive. And so the costs are higher. The labour costs tend to be higher as well in free range and extensive systems because people have a lot further to cover, and it's harder work to, say, catch an animal out on a hillside to treat than it would be if it was penned fairly tightly in a shed. So there are a number of reasons, but another one is that free-range animals also tend to be slower growing. They don't gain weight to the same extent, and so rather than being ready for slaughter, say, a broiler chicken intensively produced in a shed may be ready for slaughter at 7 weeks old, 5 to 7 weeks old. A free-range one is likely to be 9 or 10 weeks old by the time it's ready for slaughter. So there's the additional feeding costs during that period, as well as the additional time it's spent in a house and being looked after. So the number of crops that can be put through are reduced as well. So it all leads to higher costs for the extensive systems.
And am I right in thinking, Sheila, that every animal born on a farm in the UK is registered and given an ear tag at birth, which I guess means that they can be traced back if there was any problem with a particular animal?
Yeah, every cattle bovine animal is treated like that. It's not the same once you get to thinking about pigs, sheep and poultry, which are managed according to groups. So you would know about the mortality rate or the problems in a flock of poultry, but you wouldn't know about the individuals. Whereas with cattle, from within a week of birth, people have a week to register. From that point, cattle are treated as individuals and you can follow them through the system.
And I guess that's just to do with the sheer number of those animals.
It's partly to do with the sheer number, but it's partly because of the BSE problems that we had back in the late 80s and early 90s, where it became really important to understand the genetics and the way disease was spreading. And so individual identification was far more important at that point.
And for some, well, in fact, for all of those listening, I imagine, that are still at school, they might not be fully aware of what the BSE crisis was. I don't know, maybe if you could just quickly summarise what that was and your role and the implication of that.
Of course I can. BSE, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or more commonly called mad cow disease, was a problem that affected the brains of cattle, but it was linked to feeding practices where some ruminant protein was being recycled. And the infective agent, which is a really interesting one, it's called a prion, and it's even smaller than a virus. It's just a bit of infected protein that was being fed back to cattle and was spreading through the feeding, but also from mother to offspring. And so it became really important to know where animals were at each time, so that the disease at any time, and what the relationships were so that the disease could be controlled. Fortunately, there are huge numbers of controls in place so that that can't happen again. But it was a really stark warning that giving animals inappropriate feeding, in that case, can lead to serious problems, not just for animals, but with the linked disease in humans, CJD.
And there was a huge public health concern at the time. And I guess that had big implications to the amount of beef that people were eating in Scotland at the time.
It did. Quite a number of people just stopped eating beef completely at that time because of the uncertainties about whether the disease was spread to humans through infected beef. It also meant that we couldn't export beef to anywhere in the world. And that had a significant impact on the profitability of farming in this country, and a number of farmers went out of business as a result. It was an animal health crisis, but also a public health crisis, and economically it was very important as well.
Yeah, I think we're all now aware of the economic impact of public health matters, yes, and how it all links together.
As never before.
But I guess there was a huge amount went into that, including genetic studies and being able to trace all this back. So, it's maybe quite a good example of how different parts of the course kind of tie together in real life.
Yes, I think it is. Obviously,
going on to become a vet, I guess you would have studied science at school. What was your favourite subject at school?
It's going to sound creepy crawly, but it was biology.
Excellent.
And I guess that was because I've always been really curious about how living things work, but also because I had a really good and enthusiastic biology teacher who didn't just make it a dry subject. He brought it to life. And I think that makes a huge difference.
Do you remember their name? Do you want to give them a wee shout out?
Well, there were two. There was Mr. George and Mrs. Smith. They're probably both dead by now because they were quite elderly at that time. I remember Mr. George saying that Mrs. Smith has forgotten more than I'll ever know.
I can't imagine they ever envisaged being mentioned on a podcast then.
Probably not, no.
What can you tell us then about your journey from leaving school to where you are now? As you mentioned, you're a vet, but you're also one of the senior government advisors within your current role.
Yeah. I always wanted to be a vet. My parents kept trying to tell me I should be a doctor instead, but I wanted to be a vet. I went to the university in Edinburgh after I did my hires, and then I went and worked in practice, initially in Yorkshire for a couple of years, which was really interesting. But then I came back to the borders and worked in practice here. And it was only really by chance that I joined the government vet service. First of all, doing practical work, going out, doing welfare visits, doing TB testing, doing some other of the practical field-based jobs. I did it as a stopgap until my practice job came back, but it didn't. And I went on from there, was seconded to policy, decided I quite liked it, and just moved up the tree from there. So really it was about taking opportunities when they presented themselves and not being afraid to try something different.
And that in itself, I think, a great message and a great life lesson for people. What can you tell us then about those welfare visits that you mentioned? What did those entail, and are those surprise visits? Do people know that you're coming to prepare for them? Or is there a combination of these kind of things?
They're usually unannounced visits. Occasionally you would give somebody an hour's notice just so that there was going to be somebody around who could facilitate the visit. I wouldn't want to walk into a poultry shed unannounced in case I caused hysteria, panic, manic behaviour. But by and large, they were to more extensive species, and usually they were unannounced. Sometimes because the farmer's name had randomly come up as part of a required subset to do, but sometimes because there had been complaints from neighbours, walkers, passers-by, his wife, the neighbour. Some of them were grudges. We got to know you would get complaints about the same farmer from the same person every week. And eventually you don't go every time. So some of them, yes, were spurious. Some of them were people just not understanding, complaining that cattle were out with no shelter in the summer because they'd get wet. And again, that's fairly normal for cattle. But there have been some fairly horrible ones, and I think particularly of a farm in the outskirts of Glasgow, where the farmer was having mental health problems and had basically allowed a group of cattle to go feral. They were uncastrated males in amongst females, interbreeding, they had horns, they weren't being fed properly. And the resolution for that one eventually was that we got a marksman in and shot some of them because we just couldn't do anything else. We didn't prosecute the farmer because there was nothing to be gained by that. What he needed was help to get out of that situation rather than being penalised for being in it in the first place.
And I guess the responsibilities on those farmers are quite intense and maybe not something that we often consider, but the repercussions of that, as you mentioned, were quite severe, and that must be quite an upsetting process for yourself and everyone involved in that.
It is. It's very upsetting for everyone, particularly that it's got to that stage without anybody realising or reporting it. But once you find a situation like that, you have to focus on what you can do to make it better. And for those animals, some of them we were able to rehome to other farms and they led a productive life. But for some of them, taking them out of that situation by euthanizing them humanely was the right thing to do.
What advice would you give to any young person thinking of becoming a vet or any other role in animal welfare or working with animals in Scotland?
I'd say go for it. It's a really exciting thing to do. You're never going to be a millionaire doing it, but there are huge rewards from it. And if you're interested, then by all means go for it. Do your research first, though. There are lots of vets out there working in different areas. It's not just about being in practice. There are vets who are working to protect human health through meat inspection or food safety work. There are vets doing research. There are vets working for the government. So there are a whole range of things that vets can do. You just need to decide which one is right for you. And if you decide it's not being a vet, there are other careers. You can do agriculture degrees or do welfare science or zoology or plenty of other things that will get you involved in animals and animal welfare.
I remember watching something with a vet in it, and they were going through, I think the vet was possibly inspecting cattle who were pregnant to see how many calves were expected. And a pupil had asked the question. I think the pupils were first of all quite. There was quite a reaction as to the way when the vet obviously inspected the cow.
Hand up the bottom.
The hand up the bottom, and I was asked by a pupil what that felt like, and I have to say I've never been able to give an answer to that question, but you might be able to.
It feels warm and tight. I'm trying to think of anything else that might feel like it. I suppose it's like putting your hand into a jumper that clings to you and is warm. And certainly I have a number of jumpers that I've cut one arm out of because in freezing cold nights, the hand that's inside the cow is nice and warm, but the other one is absolutely perished.
So certainly not something that should put anyone off thinking of becoming a vet.
No, and you do get to wear gloves. It's not that you get nasty stuff up your fingernails.
No, I think that'd be quite important. One of those random questions you get asked as a teacher that you're never quite sure how to answer. So there we go.
Oh, I still get them.
Why should young people be concerned about animal welfare?
I'd go back to what Gandhi said. A civilization can be judged on the way it treats its animals. If we think we're civilised, we need to make sure that those animals we're responsible for are looked after as well as we can and lead a good life. We spoke about the 5 freedoms. That's largely now being replaced by unnecessary suffering, a life worth living. But the aspiration is a good life and, if necessary, a good death at the end of that. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to try to make sure that animals that we have responsibility for do lead a good life.
I guess the way an animal dies is very much part of that. And therefore has to be monitored.
Is. Yes, there are plenty of people who will tell you that it's wrong to kill animals, and that's a view that they're perfectly entitled to hold. For myself, however, if we're going to rear animals for food and eat them, then it's equally important that when we slaughter them, we do so in as humane a way as we can. Slaughter or death itself isn't generally a welfare problem as long as it's humane. Going suddenly from living to dead is not a bad thing to do. It's much worse to have periods of prolonged suffering and bad welfare in between. So it's a personal view, but I think eating meat is okay as long as you make sure that the animal is cared for during life and death.
And it's obviously just one of the many personal choices we all face in daily life.
Yes.
And it's just great to obviously to understand a little bit more and have that educated knowledge in order to make those decisions with a sort of clear conscience.
Absolutely. I think, as so often, education is the key to everything that we do. If you understand things, you can make a rational decision.
Yep, and that decision obviously is different, for one person to the other, but as long as you have the education... It's different
for different people. Yeah, it's different for different people, but that's right. I never tell people they shouldn't be vegetarian or vegan. I'm not, but I respect those choices as long as they respect my choice.
Thank you so much for obviously taking the time to do that. It's just thoroughly appreciated.
I'm just so impressed that you're doing it. I think this is the way that we encourage children and young people to start thinking about what they do and making their own decisions.
Delivering improvements in animal health and welfare is not a job for just one agency or group. Government, industry, enforcement agencies, retailers, and every single one of us as consumers have a part to play. You can subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you choose to listen, so you can be sure you never miss an episode and continue to become informed and responsible citizens. And remember, you can get 40% off all Lecky textbooks, revision guides and practice papers using the discount code LeckyPodcast40 online at www.leckyscotland.co.uk.